So we're going to read Mike Rothwell's Checkout Day. There's always a way out of prison, any prison, and it can be done right now, today. The authorities can't stop you. Well, they can slow you down if you're careless, but they can't really stop you if you're determined enough.
It's called checking out, or taking it to the vent, or even moving on to the next phase. Sometimes I think about the guys that were there with me when I first came into prison who are no longer here. The vast majority were done in by their own hand.
I think the all-time winner for originality would have to be Ben. He was a neighbor of mine in Folsom. What Ben did was take an ordinary electrical extension cord and cut it in two with toenail clippers. Still using the clippers, he stripped the insulation back a few inches on both ends where the wire had been cut. On the half that didn't plug into the wall, he took most of the rest of the insulation off and wrapped it around himself. He put a wet washcloth in his mouth. I always wondered if that made any difference. And plugged the other half into the wall socket, but without touching the now live end to the one he was wrapped up in, so it didn't complete the circuit.
After that, he laid down on his bunk with both exposed ends of the wire in hand and then held them together. I found out later from one of the guys that worked in the library that Ben had been studying all the books dealing with electricity he could find. He had rather ingeniously figured out how to wrap himself up in a way that didn't trip the circuit breaker as he was gradually cooked.
I thought about how many times I've been shocked for just a second or two by an electrical outlet. Maybe a dozen times, give or take. When carelessly changing a light bulb without unplugging it first or what have you, it's not a pleasant feeling, but it's sure not going to kill you right away either. Ben had to actually hold those wires together as he was slow roasted by 120 volts. That's determination.
By the time they got his remains to the infirmary, which was several minutes after they found him, his core body temperature was still over 120 degrees. At least that was as high as their thermometer went. Flesh literally flayed off his bones like the meat off a rack of well-done spare ribs. Later, a bad joke on the yard was that you could stick a fork in him. He was done.
But it was in San Quentin that I witnessed my most memorable suicide.
It was Christmas time, but the season of joy for much of the world often turned into deep depression for some of the denizens of that Gothic Bastille by the bay.
At the time, Donna's section in South Block was pretty much the end of the line for the guys who had gotten in trouble for one thing or another throughout California's other state prisons. And it also served to house the overflow for the condemned from death row. It's the inner cell block where our life's dramas play out.
There was reading, fishing, passing items via handmade lines from cell to cell, and exercise, lots of push-ups to spend one's time. But you had to be on guard, for death stalked those ancient tears. Clinical depression was what could give the reaper the key to your cell. Don't say it couldn't happen to you. Better not to tempt fate. You had to always be on guard against succumbing to conditions that can spawn a state of mind so foul it can cause a young man in the prime of life to want to leave this realm. No matter how upbeat you may feel, there's always a part of you that's miserable. If not, then there's something really wrong with you.
Make no mistake about it, prison is punishment. People suffer. People die. Months and years in that kind of environment can twist anyone's mind to some degree. I don't think it's a matter of just staying strong. I think it's more a matter of never letting your guard down. Don't let it get to you. You have to be vigilant to keep that inner demon at arm's length. It's always going to be there, so you better learn to keep it at bay. One way is to keep doing them push-ups. They help.
The cops are supposed to patrol the tiers a little more often during the Yuletide season because people do get more down than usual. But if someone's determined to check out, then there's not much they can do about it. And that's exactly what happened one dreary December night.
I noticed some activity by the 3 block cops up on the 3rd tier, evidenced by the jingling of keys and reflection of their shadows moving on the outer wall. The gunner on one of the catwalks had spotted something that caused him to raise the alarm. A sergeant and lieutenant strolled in a few minutes later and trudged up the stairs towards the third tier.
Hush talk snaked its way down through the block. There was indeed a suicide on the third tier. On this very real, dark, and stormy night, San Quentin claimed another victim. The prison itself, or more precisely, the conditions there, killed another human being just as sure as if under its own volition it had dropped one of its medieval bricks off a wall onto somebody's head.
The whispers started, as they always do, whenever there's a suicide. What a weak punk. And variations thereof were voiced by a few. It's like the guys who say it are trying to convince themselves it could never happen to them. But you can always hear the fear in their voices, no matter how hard they try to cover it up.
I think there is a much better way, however, to break just about anyone from ever contemplating taking the easy way out. Because from the suicides I've seen, there isn't anything easy about it, and this was perhaps the ultimate case in point.
A few minutes later, the old screws sauntered down the tier with their gruesome cargo, carrying the stretcher head first on either side, with the younger cop helping balance the rear of it. It was like they were taking a leisurely walk in the park. No hurry getting this dead body out of there at all. And I wondered if they did this on purpose. Maybe they wanted us to get a good look at him because he was completely uncovered, naked except for the skivvies he had on, along with the homemade scarf he still had wrapped around his neck. The cat I saw on the stretcher looked like he was about 19 years old, and a young 19 at that. He would have looked more in place at a high school dance that night rather than being carried out of the hole, dead in San Quentin prison.
For the first time in my life, I fully understood the term death mask. The handmade noose around his neck consisted of sloppily braided strips of sheet, and his head was bent at an impossible angle in relation to his shoulders.
Evidently, he had been hanging for a while because rigor mortis had set in. He must have changed his mind about his final life decision that night because both hands were at his neck, as though he tried to undo the fix he found himself in while the last vestige of his consciousness ebbed into eternity. His attempts to ease what must have been the ever-tightening grip on his throat had obviously failed, but had caused his fingers to get trapped between the makeshift rope and his neck. Both elbows stuck out rigidly locked in place and told the story of the losing battle that played out during the last moments of his life. His eyes were half open and mouth curled back in a horrible grimace.
Homeboy made a bad choice that night. He tried to reverse the decision he made, but unlike a lot of us who at one time or another in our lives screw up royally, and deservedly or not, get another chance, he didn't. He tempted fate, but fate was in no mood to be fooled with that night. The cops went out and slammed the steel door shut behind them as they made their way to the prison morgue.
Not 10 minutes later, they were back. It was as quiet in that huge cell block as it ever was. Usually there were various types of yelling at all hours around the clock, conversations between cells on different tiers, chess games hollered back and forth between cells, or just the senseless babble the nuts spew out in order to validate their existence. But not right then. There was only solemn silence. Even the crazy guys had shut up.